Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm going to be sharing a brand new Hey Arnold short story I wrote called Through Hope. This is my latest one. I posted it in October, and I've got some things to say about it, but I will do so after I actually read it. So let's just go ahead and dive in. Without further ado, it's story time. The world could be so needlessly cruel at times. If there was anyone who knew this miserable fact to be true, it was Helga Pataki. In her 16 years, she'd already had more than her fair share of crappy times. Between a neglectful mother, a narcissistic father, and an obnoxious older sister, she never knew what a happy home was. Parents who paid attention to you, who cared for you, who made sure you ate well and that you did your homework and cheered you on and supported you. A sister you could confide in when you didn't want to talk to your parents about something embarrassing, who you truly knew would never judge you no matter what. A family who loved you unconditionally. It all seems like a fantasy world. She was lucky to get to experience even a fraction of that picture-perfect family life through Arnold. He'd been a particularly lucky one, but then, that was no surprise in the slightest, as he was the most incredible person in the entire world. If anyone deserved a real chance to experience what it was like to have a happy family, not just with his loving, albeit kooky, grandparents, but with the most kind-hearted parents a kid could ask for, it was him. And he'd finally gotten that chance when he reunited with his mom and his dad on that unforgettable trip to San Lorenzo. Their lives had completely changed after that trip. Arnold got his parents, and Helga got him. There had certainly been days, especially early on in their relationship, when she'd woken up and literally had to check her room just to make sure she hadn't dreamt the entire thing. But the evidence was always there in front of her, namely in her golden locket she now kept on her nightstand, still with a taped-together picture of Arnold staring back at her with that half-lidded gape that made her heart sing. She'd thought about replacing the picture, but that torn-up photo reminded her of everything she'd almost lost. Of everything her younger self had always wanted and had finally gotten after years and years of self-torment over unrequited love. It brought her back to the depths of the jungle that had truly changed their lives forever, to the sweet look on Arnold's face, his gentle voice when he'd handed her back her locket in gratitude. Their first kiss. Well, not exactly their first, but the first one he'd initiated, the first one to mark the true beginning of their relationship. 5 years later, and they were still together. It had taken a lot of vulnerability and trust on her part to let Arnold in. Thankfully, he was always patient and understanding of her, as she knew he would be, for he was Arnold, the living embodiment of empathy. While their relationship had many obstacles to navigate at first, mostly stemming from her usual brassness and underlying fear that she'd scare him off, he'd managed to gradually chip away at those fears and draw out the sensitive person she'd so expertly hidden from the world. She'd come a long way from the early days of their relationship when she'd deny him to even hold her hand in public. Now, while she still wasn't always comfortable with public displays of affection, the occasional handhold or even kiss on the lips had become second nature to them. It felt weird at first to acknowledge their relationship to their peers, but Gerald and Phoebe had managed to do so without any trouble, and as always, if anyone could get Helga to come around, it was Arnold. It was him, after all, who'd reminded her that she deserved happiness, that it was okay to feel scared or embarrassed sometimes. It was okay because he accepted her for who she was, in all her faults, in all her mistakes when she'd occasionally slip up and insult him. He always forgave her, as he knew she had no true malice behind her insults. He knew she had a hard time expressing herself without feeling like a lovesick dolt, and after 5 years together, the biggest bumps in the road seemed to be long behind them. That is, until that horrifying day she'd gotten that phone call. In hindsight, she should have known something was wrong the moment she saw who was calling her. Gerald, of all people. She'd almost thought it was a mistake at first, and that he'd meant to call Harold or something. It wasn't that she didn't get along with Gerald, and it wasn't that the two of them hardly ever interacted other than quick exchanges here and there. On the contrary, it was really out of respect, above anything else, that they kept their distance from one another. They had this unspoken, mutual understanding that they wouldn't get in each other's way of their respective relationships. After all, they were dating each other's best friend, so if Helga didn't hear from Phoebe for a while, or if Arnold was too busy to hang out with Gerald, both of them knew not to prod the other and ask why they were hogging their best friend, because that was never the case at all. But since he was calling her directly, that could only mean something unthinkable had happened, And sure enough, when she answered, she heard it the second he spoke in a troublingly somber tone of voice. The next thing she knew, she was at the hospital, getting bits and pieces of information that Gerald didn't have the answers to himself. Numbly, she stood between a frantic Stella and a solemn Phil and Gertie as the doctors went over medical jargon with them. Arnold and his dad had been in an accident. Miles in critical condition, Arnold stable but not without injuries. Suddenly Helga was in a waking nightmare, too sick to her stomach to do anything but nod along as the doctors explained that they'd be monitoring their vitals and couldn't do anything more but take things one step at a time. In her feverish haze, she'd wanted to scream, to kick and punch something or someone, but she merely stood guard as Stella crumbled and Phil and Gertie comforted their daughter-in-law. When the doctors allowed them to go inside, Helga blindly followed. She saw Miles first, hooked up to a bunch of machines and with bandages around his head. Despite the steady beep of the machine monitoring his heart rate, all Helga could hear were Stella's muffled sobs as she collapsed by her husband's bedside. Arnold's looked far better by comparison, but seeing him in such a grave condition didn't stop Helga's heart from plummeting to the ground. She hadn't realized she was shaking until Phil put a hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked meek, not the guy who was strong as an ox and could take on anything. It was her love for Arnold that fueled her bravery to walk up to him to get a closer look. She touched his hand, which felt warm and smooth like it always did. "Arnold," she whispered, a deep ache in her chest. "It's me, Helga. His eyes suddenly fluttered open, wide and alert, and she gasped so loudly that now Phil was at her side, staring at his grandson like he couldn't believe his eyes. "Arnold?" he said in sheer astonishment. "It's okay, short man. Everything's going to be okay. You hang tight. I'll go tell the doctors you're awake." As quickly as he'd appeared by her side, Phil was out the door just as fast, while Helga stayed rooted in place. Her gaze remained glued on Arnold, whose piercing green eyes stared at her in apology. How like him to feel guilty at a time like this. Her hand instinctually tightened around his hand. With the two of them alone for however many seconds longer before his mom or grandma or Gerald came in, she gave in to everything she was feeling and crumbled against his chest, crying with the unspeakable pain of almost losing him, the overwhelming relief that he was all right. Between her ragged sobs and pounding heart, it was amazing she'd even registered a gentle hand on her back. Swallowing the rest of her relentless tears, Helga lifted her head to find Arnold's calming gaze. Leave it to him to find the strength to comfort her in a situation like this. Now all she could do was grin like the lovesick fool she was. Before she could stop herself, she leaned down and pressed her lips against his cheek, not even caring when she heard the doctor's voice. "Don't you dare scare me like that ever again, football head," she spat as she wiped her eyes and released a shaky sigh, stepping back only so Stella could have a turn to hug and kiss her son like there was no tomorrow. While Arnold was discharged from the hospital the following morning, they learned it was going to be an uphill battle for Miles. It had been 2 full days now, but Arnold remained by his father's bedside along with his mother, holding her hand while she hugged him and stroked his hair. "You do know you have to go to school tomorrow, right, sweetheart?" Stella said, a pointless question but a necessary one all the same. Of course they all knew that, as painful as it probably was to be reminded. Your father wouldn't want you to keep worrying about him all day. Arnold looked at Miles, as if in some wild hope his condition would change in the next few seconds. "But I know, Arnold," Stella said, smiling warmly at him. Arnold's got his smile from his mom, Helga had long since realized, warm and comforting and full of charm. "I know it's hard, but I don't want you to feel guilty for living your life. Your dad will be okay, just like you." She kissed his forehead, and Arnold managed a small smile. "I still can't believe how much you're growing up right before our eyes. I'm so grateful She cast a look at Miles in the hospital bed, the bandages around his head, the machines hooked up to him. She shook her head, turning back to Arnold with a fresh mist of tears in her eyes. "We're getting to see you grow up." "All thanks to Helga," Arnold said. They both looked at her from where she stood at the foot of the bed, and she immediately shrunk down in embarrassment. She knew Arnold hadn't meant to fluster her, but she also knew he was more than aware that it didn't take much to do so. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she flicked her wrist as nonchalantly as she could despite the flash of heat rising to her face. "It was nothing, really," she said. Seeing the tears in their eyes only lit the fiery embers of her passionate nature she always kept dormant, waiting to be awakened at any given moment. I've told you that a million times, Arnaldo. You're the one who never gave up hope. It's all because of you, not me. Both Stella and Arnold grinned in appreciation, which softened Helga all over again. Mother and son, two of a kind. Arnold gave his mom another hug. I'll be back first thing after school tomorrow, he said. Finally, he got up and headed over to Helga, taking her hand. Her heart melted at the feeling of his hand around hers, as it always did. I love you, Mom. Love you, Arnold, Stella said. Helga. Helga nodded. I'll take care of him, Mrs. Shortman. I can always count on you, she said with a wink. The crisp night air bit at Helga's nose, and she shivered involuntarily, though something told her the coolness in the air had little to do with it. Arnold wrapped an arm around her, which only made Helga freeze again. She met his gaze to find a forlorn yet grateful smile on his face. Thanks for being here, he said warmly. Arnold, please, Helga said, devoid of any biting sarcasm she liked to throw at him every now and then. For old time's sake, maybe, but mostly because it was still in her blood to be rough around the edges. He may have made her a hell of a lot softer over the years, but she was still Helga, and she knew that was one of the reasons he loved her. Arnold loved her. That was still hard to believe sometimes, even though the proof was right there in the way he looked at her, the way he held her, teased her, boosted her confidence, soothed her when her short temper crept up on her. Even after all this time, it never ceased to amaze her how he'd forever have such a profound effect on her. Sweeping her arms around the back of his neck, she relished the way his eyes bulged for a second. She had her own special effect on him too, of course. She leaned in, grazing his nose with her own, and she allowed her voice to dip to its sweet cadence she only reserved for him as she said, You know there's nowhere else I'd rather be. And she captured his lips in a deep, deep kiss. Her heart twirled, and her stomach flipped upside down and back again as her beloved Arnold melted into her embrace, his hands cupping the small of her back and pulling her in even closer. With a forceful smack of the lips, she drew back before things could get too passionate. That's enough of that, she said a bit breathlessly. I don't want to be the couple of weirdos who make out in front of a hospital. Arnold chuckled, a sound that was pure music to Helga's ears, especially after seeing him so torn up and worried the past couple of days. He stroked a hand over her cheek, and her heart buzzed with electricity. Criminy, I'm like putty in his hands. I think it's a little late for that, he said. This time he pulled her in and smoothly captured her lips with his own, completely sending her over the moon in this perfect, blissful moment. Well, crap, how am I supposed to resist this? And so she wound her arms around him once more. The moments of levity sadly grew farther and farther between as the weeks wore on. By the second week, it was clear the doctors didn't know how long Miles would be in this condition. Days, months, it was anybody's guess. Helga had wanted to laugh at the morbid irony of it all, because really, the guy and his wife had already been in a decade-long coma and had managed to survive that. 5 years later, and here he was again. Seriously, one coma wasn't enough for a person. The world could be so needlessly cruel at times. His second week in the hospital came and went, and while there were still little to no signs of improvement, there weren't any worsening signs either, which apparently was the silver lining of it all. Still, there was one painfully obvious, devastating sign that things were in fact worsening. It was something Helga had dreaded would happen someday, maybe from her own cynical nature, or maybe from the fact that she'd experienced the torturous betrayal of crushed hope far too many times in her life. She knew the feeling far too well, like stomping on a flower and mashing up all the petals in a crumpled-up disarray, leaving behind nothing but a bare, broken stem. Just like when she'd foolishly ripped up her picture of Arnold and tossed her locket into the river on that fateful trip, thinking it was all over between them before it had ever really begun. This was that same feeling, only so much worse, because it was the one thing she'd never ever wanted to happen. Arnold was starting to lose hope. The ray of sunlight that was his ever-optimistic attitude was dimming. He was moping around more, becoming more listless, more withdrawn. And sure, he had every right to feel sad. He was human, after all, a one-of-a-kind human whose beacon of head-in-the-clouds idealism had always served as Helga's personal guiding light throughout her life, but still a human nevertheless. Now his positive outlook was crumbling before his eyes, and it completely devastated her. Arnold's grandparents, for what it was worth, had gone back to things as best they could. They still had a boarding house to run, after all. Even Stella, when she wasn't by her husband's side at the hospital, had returned to some sense of normalcy. But Arnold, though he was still going to school like his mother wanted, was doing everything on autopilot. Gerald tried to get him to hang out at the arcade or play some ball at Gerald Field, but Arnold would only decline, insisting he had to go be with his dad. Helga was by his side during all of these hospital visits, keeping a protective hand on his knee while he mechanically held her hand and stared at his dad for any signs of change. It was one thing when his parents had been in a coma the whole time and he hadn't known about it until he'd find both of them, though Helga would forever feel she didn't deserve any credit no matter what Arnold said, managed to save them. It was an entirely different thing to see Arnold's dad withering away like this. Eventually, through gentle coaxing from the nurses, Arnold finally willed himself to leave for the night. It was dark and cold when they stepped outside, and this time when Helga shivered, Arnold didn't put his arm around her. Not out of carelessness, she knew, but because he clearly didn't have the strength to provide comfort right now. It was all on her to be the strong one, which was nothing new, but this was a different kind of strength. Helga being optimistic? Arnold had been doing that their whole lives. But that was who he was. The very least she could do was give it a shot. She had to, for his sake. Arnold, she heard herself say, and she paused, as her voice was already betraying her efforts to try to get through to him. It sounded soft, surprisingly frail. She put a hand to his shoulder, and while he didn't meet her eyes, that wouldn't stop her from trying. He'll wake up. Deep down, you know that, right? Of course you do. You wouldn't be you if you didn't. Tell me in that dreamy football head of yours that you know in your heart your dad's going to be okay. You gotta. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them and finally looked at her, there was no light, no gleam of hope, just a blank, heavy stare. Her hand fell from his shoulder. "I'll walk you home," he said. He started to walk away, and Helga's heart sank miserably, only for a flash of anger to strike down with a vengeance. She grabbed him by the shoulders and yanked him back, keeping her hands firmly planted on his shoulders so he couldn't get away. "Listen to me," she said, the usual fire in her voice returning. "I know things suck right now, but your dad's still here. There's still hope. Who knows about hope better than you? Nobody. So quit wallowing already and please, try to think positive like you always do." Her tone was more pleading than anything, desperate to get through to him, but she was met with nothing but that broken look in his eyes. Gently he took her hands and removed them from his shoulders, holding them half-heartedly, like if he let go she'd just put them right back. "I appreciate what you're telling me, Helga, but things are different this time," he said plainly and solemnly. It absolutely killed her. He released her hands, and while she immediately missed the warmth, she knew all she could do right now was listen. "My whole life I've always been able to look on the bright side because I knew I could do whatever it took to help someone, whether it was by cheering them up or reminding them what they're capable of. Sometimes it meant reminding myself, too. But things are out of my hands now. My dad might not wake up, and I have to face that fact. As much as it hurts, I have no choice. Like you said, life does suck sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes. But we have to keep living our lives. It's all we can do. So come on, let's go home." Now he held his hand out to her, and Helga stared at his open palm and spread fingers, waiting. The longer she stared, the heavier her heart felt. How she wished more than anything she could take his pain away from him. Instead, all she could do was accept his hand as they walked together in a heavy silence. An upcoming test turned out to be a welcome distraction for the both of them. "Criminy, there are so many traffic laws," Helga said, going through the practice questions on her laptop. "And yet they're basically all common sense. Slow down in a school zone, don't go over the speed limit, no duh. How anybody flunks the written portion of a driver's test is beyond me." "Harold flunked twice before passing on his third try," Arnold said. Helga scoffed. "Harold's a total moron, like most people." "Helga," Arnold said sternly. She looked at him for a second, but it was more than long enough to catch the unflinching, disappointed gaze of his. She heaved a hard sigh and reluctant apology. "Fine," she said. "He's not so dumb. Not all the time, at least." Arnold smiled, as he knew it wasn't always easy for her to admit when she was wrong. If anyone could help her break her natural cruel streak and try her best to be nicer whenever she possibly could, it was him. She knew she'd gotten better in recent years. At the very least, she didn't insult people to their faces as much as she used to. Not that saying mean things behind their backs was any better, but she could only do so much sometimes. Slamming her laptop closed, she snatched the study guide from Arnold's hands. He blinked, hands curved open with the missing book. "It's my turn to quiz you now," she said. Arnold shrugged and dropped his hands. "Sure, go ahead." Let's see. She flipped through the book until she landed on a section about tires. "How often should you rotate your car's tires?" "Every 6 months," Arnold said like the good student he was. "Or roughly every 6,000 miles. Technically here it says every 5,000 to 8,000, Helga said, pointing to the numbers in the book. "But hey, that was pretty good. You're not so dumb either." "Gee, thanks," Arnold said in amusement. "Don't mention it," Helga said as she shut the book and sat up, tossing it behind her shoulder. "I think we've earned ourselves a break, wouldn't you say?" "But you only asked me one question," Arnold said. You'll be fine," Helga said dismissively. "There is such a thing as too much studying, you know." "Whatever you say, Helga," Arnold said in that all-too-familiar way of his. Helga moved her laptop from her bed and placed it on her nightstand, where her precious locket gleamed back at her. How crazy it was that she was able to leave it out here in plain sight now, no longer hiding it away from the world in a deep, dark secret. And how even crazier that Arnold himself was sitting here on her bed, that he'd not only accepted her heart long ago, but had opened his heart to her in return. "Hey, Helga," Arnold said, snapping her out of her reverie. He'd drawn his knees to his chest, his eyes cast down in wistful contemplation. "I've been thinking, we've been together for a long time now, and, well," Helga blinked. If there was one fault of hers that truly never would go away, it was her impatience whenever someone left their thought hanging for no reason. "Well, what?" she demanded. Arnold met her gaze, and her heart jumped. Another thing that would never go away, how all of her senses exploded whenever Arnold looked at her like that. A deep, soul-bearing stare. She could tell that whatever was on his mind had been so for a while, and for whatever reason he decided that this was the right time to bring it up. Whatever it was he was about to say, she told herself she had to remember to breathe. After all, he could tell her anything. "I think we're ready," he finally said. And that was all he said. The words were simple, but the weight behind them landed on her like an anvil to the head. She blinked, trying helplessly to make sense of the words as they echoed in her mind. "Ready? Is he talking about what I think he's talking about?" The word lingered from her lips despite her brain having already connected the dots. Arnold merely smirked in response, though not in his usual warm and innocent way. It was more playful than anything else. Teasing, even. It was clear he knew that she definitely understood what he was saying without him having to elaborate, as this small gesture only cemented it. Hell, he was almost being, dare she even think it, seductive? It became painstakingly obvious when he reached out and brushed his palm over her thigh, leaving her to full-on gasp. "Arnold," she said, using all her resistance not to shriek. She promptly clamped her fingers around his hand before he could dare do that again. It wasn't that he was out of line, and it wasn't that she didn't like it. She just really needed to think straight for a second, and if he did that again, she'd be a goner. "You're telling me you want to—" She trailed off, unable to say the actual words out loud. Not because she was a prude, but because she didn't know she'd be able to resist him much longer if she actually said it. She shook her head, deciding to spit the truth at him whether he wanted to hear it or not. "Your dad's in the hospital, you freak! Are you crazy?" "Maybe," Arnold said simply. How like him to be so matter-of-fact at a time like this. Really, how come he was able to keep his composure while she herself was increasingly ready to pass out? Thankfully for her, he didn't seem to pick up on her internal freak-out as he added, I really want our first time to be special. You deserve that. Don't you want to?" "Yeah, but..." The words had come out of her mouth so easily, though she forced herself to stop. Seriously, how was he not freaking out right now? Was he really, truly ready? Was she? Her eyes started frantically searching her room, as if in doing so she'd find the answers. It wasn't that she didn't want to. She dreamt of this scenario 1,000+ times. But here? Now? Why now? "What's wrong?" Arnold asked. Her eyes landed back on him. The mischievous look was gone, replaced now by that deep concern he wore so well. It brought her a sense of calmness she so desperately needed. Her shoulders dropped with a long, resolute sigh, and she finally let go of his hand. "I do want to," she said, her voice almost impossibly soft. Frankly, she no longer had the strength to freak out anymore. What was there to panic about anyway? She trusted him more than anyone in the world. They both knew that. It was because of that trust that she was able to be honest with him, and with herself, too. But I don't think we're ready yet. Maybe we will be soon, but not now. Not like this, when you're worried about your dad and what's going to happen to him, if he'll ever actually... She swallowed the rest of her words. There was no need to dwell on the bleakness of the situation. He'd been through more than enough emotional turmoil already. I understand, Arnold said. In spite of everything, Helga frowned. You do? She asked. Why'd she feel so sad all of a sudden? This time when Arnold's hand found hers again, she didn't move away. His thumb stroked along her knuckles, fingers enclosing around hers in a soothing grasp. How he always quelled her nerves with a sweet and simple touch was beyond her. It was amazing how he could get through to her with just a small gesture like this, far better than she ever could with any of her over-the-top emotional displays. Again, some things truly never changed. You're right, he said. We probably aren't ready yet. I think when we are, we'll just kind of know. And it'll be under happy circumstances, not while my... He too let the rest of those words fall away. I'm sorry. Like I said, you deserve it to be special. I promise I'll make it worth the wait. Oh, Arnold, my love. Helga swept her hand over the back of his head. Her eyelids slanted down and her lips curved up into more of a mischievous smirk. She knew how to turn up the charm when necessary. I appreciate that and all, but what makes you think I'm the only one waiting here? She asked. 'Cause let me tell you, when we're ready, it'll definitely be worth your while too. Got it? Arnold smiled at her in the way she loved most. That warm, all-knowing grin. She closed the gap between them with a kiss. A tantalizingly slow and intimate one. She'd had plenty of practice years ago with that old gum shrine she'd made of him, but that was absolutely nothing compared to kissing the real thing. When they parted, she couldn't help but tap a finger to his nose, loving the way an adorable blush coated his cheeks. That's more like it, she said. In one swift motion, she moved off of him, picked up the driver's guide, and opened it back up. All right, break's over. Now, where were we? Arnold chuckled good-naturedly. So how'd you do? Arnold asked as he and Helga left the DMV. What a way to spend a Saturday. At least it had been worth it. For Helga, anyway. I'll show you my score if you show me yours first. You just want to know if you did better than me, Arnold said. Helga flashed a devious grin. He knew her so well. Fine, I'll level with you. Let's show our scores at the same time. Deal, Arnold said. 1, 2, 3. They both held up their test papers for the other to see. Helga revealing her perfect score, and Arnold... Well, what do you know, Helga said, staring at the matching test score on his paper. She couldn't help but throw him a teasing look as she placed her hands on her hips. Since when did you get so smart? I owe it all to my study partner, Arnold said. Coming from anyone else in the world, she'd want to gag at how sappy it sounded, but from him it only made her insides turn to mush. She draped her arms around his shoulders while his hands took her by the waist. They were turning into one of those disgusting lovey-dovey couples, and she didn't even mind. I'm proud of you, Helga said. She stole a quick kiss, breaking it a mere moment later before she could let herself get too caught up in it. They were in public, after all. I'm proud of you too, Arnold said. I just wish I could tell my... The sadness was creeping in, she could sense it, and Helga's heart only twinged. When he felt pain, she felt it all the more. I know, she said. She let her hands slip away. Arnold, listen, I have to tell you something. I didn't want to bring it up until now because if I had, you would have been distracted while you took your test. But now that we've gotten it out of the way, there's no excuse for me not to tell you. She took a deep breath, bracing herself for an entirely new confession. Remember the other night when I told you I had to skip our study session? The real reason was because I was visiting your dad. I was there for a while, just me and him, and I told him how much you miss him and that if by some miracle he was able to hear me, if he could finally... Arnold was listening, waiting patiently for her to continue, when a car pulled up in the parking lot that made Helga's eyes widen. It wasn't just any car, but Phil's classic green Packard. What? She said to herself, because really it couldn't be. Could it? Arnold turned around and soon mirrored her shocked expression. Waving from the passenger seat was none other than Miles, looking sprightly for a guy who just spent nearly 3 weeks in the hospital. Dad? Arnold said, and suddenly he was rushing up and engulfing him in a hug the second he'd stepped out of the car. Helga stayed frozen in place. watching as father and son reunited as if they were in some sappy movie. Arnold's mom and grandparents got out of the car, and now the four of them enveloped their arms around him in a group hug. Again, it was a sight that would have made Helga want to puke if it were anybody else in the world. Instead, it only brought tears to her eyes. She really had gotten so soft. Maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. "I can't believe you're..." "How?" Arnold asked. Miles chuckled warmly. Helga had noticed a long time ago that he and Arnold had the same warm laugh, a sound so beautiful it could make anybody's troubles disappear. "Doctors agreed it was nothing short of a miracle," Miles said. "I can't really explain it. All I know is that I heard this voice in the back of my head begging me to wake up. Almost sounded like..." He looked at Helga, though only for a fleeting second, so as not to draw attention to her. She was grateful for that. "Sounded like a good friend," Miles said, smiling. He took the paper from Arnold's hand and held it up so they all could see his perfect score. "Looks like you and I will have to start driving lessons soon, huh, son?" Stella and his grandparents all looked on with proud smiles, while Arnold threw his arms around his dad again, hugging him like he never wanted to let go. "I can't wait," he said. Unable to hold back any longer, Helga ran up and joined the embrace. They welcomed her instantly, Arnold grinning at her with the deepest of adoration, while she smiled back at him with all the love in her heart. The world could be so vastly wonderful at times. Alright, that was Through Hope. So a few things about this story. Obviously, compared to other stories I've shared on this podcast, this one is much more serious in tone, whereas typically I like to share short stories that are more lighthearted, more humorous. Even the past couple of Hey Arnold stories I shared, which was Care and Audaciously Flirting, those are just more lighthearted, not as serious compared to this one. This one deals with life and death. And I had written this story as an extension of my grief because sadly we had to put our cat to sleep. And as I said in the story, the world could be so needlessly cruel at times, and that's just how that felt. But then, as how the story ends, the world can also be so vastly amazing at times. So it's always important to remember that too, that even through the darkness, there is light to be found. And obviously these are all themes explored within the series of Hey Arnold. And so with this story, it's also obviously a fairly long one. It's over 6,000 words just kind of poured out of me. And originally, though, I will say, I was going to have it be a bit darker, where Arnold would have caused the accident that led to both of them in the hospital because Miles was teaching him how to drive. And then it would have been Arnold's dealing with his guilt and kind of just falling into a depression, and Gerald trying to help out, and Helga doing her best to support him and comfort him and assure him it's not his fault. But then I thought to myself, that's a little too dark. If I had done that, it probably would have had to have been a longer story, and I just wanted to keep it kind of more concise and more just Arnold struggling with his own hope, with what makes him who he is, of always having hope, always being optimistic. So then when he doesn't have that, how does he behave? And so then, of course, he's leaning more on Helga, and Helga is doing her best to help him as much as she can. And also, I just enjoyed exploring the nuances of Arnold and Helga in a relationship. It made me want to see a season 6 just to see the two of them navigating a relationship. I think that would be amazing. And, you never know, but man, maybe a special again down the line, who knows? But my goodness. So that was fun for me to write, and just them as teenagers. So, getting their, working towards getting their driver's licenses and stuff. And so I enjoyed doing that. I enjoyed the idea of just her no longer having to hide and just having her locket right there on display. I thought that was a fun idea. So again, I love writing for these characters, and I hope you enjoyed the story as always. And for me, it was cathartic reading it out loud now. And again, remember to always have hope. So again, I could always just gush about Hey Arnold, but so just to wrap this up. So as always, thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed. And with that, that's going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. Be sure to visit storytellingsaga.com. And as always, feel free to send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by emailing me at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next episode, I will be discussing a Christmas special from a huge franchise. I've never seen this special before, so I'm excited to check it out. And that is A Garfield Christmas. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.